Sometimes the hardest thing in this world is standing up when everyone else looks away. In the winter of 1873, in a small mountain town called Red Hollow, that's exactly what happened when a man named Calder Boone walked into the Cartwright mansion to deliver lumber. What he saw in that firelit room changed everything. Evelyn Cartwright, the richest widow in the valley, stood over her maid Mara with a hot iron raised, ready to burn the girl's face for a crime she didn't commit. Boone didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and said the words no one else dared. "Lay that iron down, or you'll answer to me." What happened next shook Red Hollow to its core. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mountains around Red Hollow stood like silent sentinels, their peaks dusted white with snow that never fully melted, even in summer. But in the heart of winter, when the cold came down hard and the wind howled through the passes, those mountains became a fortress that kept the outside world at bay. That's how Calder Boone preferred it. He had lived in those heights for near about 7 years now, ever since the war ended, and he'd buried his wife Sarah in the valley below. His cabin sat tucked into a grove of pines at the edge of a meadow, a day's hard ride from Red Hollow proper. It was a simple place, built with his own hands from timber he'd felled himself. One room served for cooking, eating, and sleeping. A stone fireplace took up most of the north wall, and above it hung the tools of his trade, axes, saws, and splitting mauls, each one kept sharp and clean. Boone was a man of routine. He rose with the sun, tended to his 2 mules and the milk cow he kept in the small barn, and spent his days cutting timber in the forest. Once a month, he loaded his wagon with planks and beams and made the journey down to Red Hollow to sell his lumber and buy the few supplies he couldn't provide for himself. Salt, coffee, flour, and the occasional book when the general store had something new. He was 42 years old that winter, though his face wore the lines of a man who'd seen more than his share of hardship. His beard was thick and dark, shot through with gray at the chin. His eyes were a pale blue, the kind that seemed to look right through a person, and his hands were rough as tree bark from years of work. He stood just over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a quiet way of moving that spoke of confidence and control. Most folks in Red Hollow knew Boone by sight, but not by nature. He was polite when spoken to, paid his debts, and caused no trouble. What they didn't know, what he never spoke of, was that before he'd become a mountain man, he'd been a soldier. Not just any soldier, but a sergeant in the Union Army, a man who'd seen action from Shiloh to Appomattox. He'd carried wounded men off battlefields, held the line when others broke, and done things he didn't care to remember in the dark hours before dawn. War had a way of teaching a man what mattered and what didn't. For Boone, what mattered was keeping his word, treating people with dignity, and standing up when standing up was required. Everything else was just noise. In his cabin, on a shelf above his narrow bed, sat a worn leather journal. It had been Sarah's gift to him before he'd left for the war, and he'd carried it through every campaign. Inside were sketches he'd made during quiet moments, wildflowers from the Virginia countryside, a twisted oak tree near Chancellorsville, the face of a young private who died in his arms. And in the back, pressed between the pages, were dried flowers that Sarah had picked the summer before she'd taken ill with fever. He opened that journal most nights. Not to write, he'd never been much for words on paper, but to remember. To remind himself that there'd been beauty in his life once, and kindness, and love that had made him feel like he was more than just a man who knew how to survive. Red Hollow itself was a town of perhaps 300 souls, built in a valley where 2 streams met and formed a river that ran south toward the territorial capital. It had a main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a general store, a blacksmith shop, a saloon, a church with a white steeple, and a sheriff's office that also served as the jail. Most folks made their living from ranching or logging, and in the winter months, when the work slowed, they spent their time indoors, waiting for spring. The wealthiest family in Red Hollow, by a considerable measure, was the Cartwrights. Old Thomas Cartwright had come west before the war with money from back east and had built an empire on cattle and timber. When he died 5 years ago, he'd left everything to his wife Evelyn and their son Robert. But Robert had taken after his father's taste for whiskey more than his head for business, and 2 years back he'd ridden his horse off a cliff in a drunken stupor. That left Evelyn alone in the big house on the hill, the Cartwright mansion, as folks called it, a 2-story structure with columns and a wide porch that looked down on the town like a lord surveying his domain. Evelyn Cartwright was a woman in her middle 50s, tall and thin, with sharp features and eyes that could cut glass. She wore her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun and dressed in black, as though she were still in mourning, though most folks suspected she mourned the loss of her station more than her husband or son. She had a way of speaking to people that made them feel small, and a temper that could flare up like a brush fire over the smallest slight. The Cartwright estate employed a dozen hands, ranch workers, stable boys, a cook, and several house servants. Among them was a young woman named Mara Flynn, who'd come to Red Hollow 3 years ago with nothing but the clothes on her back and a letter of reference from a family back in St. Louis. She was 24 years old, slight of build, with auburn hair and green eyes that held a sadness she tried to hide. She worked as a maid in the mansion, cleaning rooms, tending fires, and doing whatever tasks Evelyn assigned her. Mara had learned quickly that the best way to survive in Evelyn's household was to stay quiet, work hard, and never draw attention to herself. But no matter how careful she was, Evelyn seemed to find fault. A dish not dried properly, a curtain not hung straight, a floor that showed the slightest scuff mark. For each infraction, there were consequences. A slap across the face, a denial of meals, or worse, the threat of being turned out into the cold, with no references and no prospects. The other servants pitied Mara but kept their distance. No one wanted to risk Evelyn's wrath by showing kindness to the girl she seemed to despise most. And so Mara endured, day after day, holding on to the hope that someday she might save enough to leave Red Hollow and start fresh somewhere else. It was a thin hope, but it was all she had. The town itself turned a blind eye to what happened in the Cartwright mansion. Sheriff Horace Dunn was a man who understood where power lay, and it didn't lay with a poor maid who had no family and no voice. It lay with Evelyn Cartwright, who owned half the land in the valley and could make or break a man's livelihood with a word. So when rumors circulated about Evelyn's treatment of her servants, Dunn made it clear that what happened in a person's home was their own business, and he had no cause to interfere. It was a cold bargain, the kind that allowed cruelty to flourish in the shadows, while good people looked away and told themselves it wasn't their concern. But there are some men who can't look away. Some men who carry inside them a sense of right and wrong that doesn't bend to convenience or fear. Calder Boone was one of those men. He didn't go looking for trouble, didn't seek out causes to champion. But when trouble found him, when he was faced with a choice between doing what was easy and doing what was right, there was never really a choice at all. On the morning of January 15th, 1873, Boone loaded his wagon with planks of pine and oak, hitched up his mules, and started down the mountain road toward Red Hollow. The sky was clear, the air sharp and clean, and he had no reason to think this trip would be any different from the dozens he'd made before. He had no way of knowing that by sundown, everything would change. The wagon wheels crunched through frozen snow as Boone guided his mules down the winding road into Red Hollow. The town looked peaceful enough in the afternoon light, smoke rising from chimneys, a few folks moving along the boardwalk, going about their business. He stopped first at the general store to drop off a load of firewood he'd promised to the owner, then headed toward the edge of town where the Cartwright mansion sat on its hill. Evelyn Cartwright had sent word through the storekeeper 2 weeks prior that she needed oak planks for repairs to her stable. It was good money, and Boone had no reason to refuse the work. He'd delivered lumber to the estate twice before and had never set foot inside the house itself. The foreman usually met him at the barn, inspected the wood, and paid him on the spot, But when Boone pulled his wagon up to the mansion that afternoon, there was no foreman waiting. The yard was empty, except for a single horse tied at the rail, its breath steaming in the cold air. Boone climbed down from the wagon, brushed the road dust from his coat, and walked up to the front door. He knocked twice, the sound echoing in the stillness. After a moment, the door opened. A woman in a cook's apron stood there, her face pale, and her eyes wide with something that looked like fear. "Mr. Boone," she said quickly. "The foreman's not here today. Mrs. Cartwright said to bring the lumber around back, and she'll settle with you directly." There was something in her voice, a tremor that made Boone pause. "Everything all right, ma'am?" The cook glanced over her shoulder, then back at him. "Best you just go around back, sir, please." Boone nodded slowly. He returned to his wagon and drove it around the side of the mansion toward the rear entrance. As he approached, he heard a voice raised in anger, a woman's voice, sharp and venomous. Then another sound, quieter, like someone crying. He set the brake and climbed down. The back door to the mansion stood slightly ajar, warm light spilling out onto the frozen ground. Boone walked toward it, his boots crunching on the snow. As he reached the doorway, the angry voice grew clearer. "You miserable little thief! Do you think I'm a fool? Do you think I wouldn't notice?" Boone pushed the door open and stepped inside. He found himself in a large kitchen, the fire in the hearth blazing hot. Evelyn Cartwright stood in the center of the room, her black dress stark against the warm wood tones of the walls. In her right hand she held a flat iron, the kind used for pressing clothes. The iron's face glowed red from the fire. On the floor, backed against the wall, was Mara Flynn. Her face was streaked with tears, and her hands were raised in front of her as though trying to ward off a blow. The front of her plain dress was torn, and Boone could see bruises already forming on her arms. "Mrs. Cartwright," Boone said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. Evelyn spun toward him, her face twisted with rage. "How dare you enter my home without permission?" Boone's eyes moved from Evelyn to Mara, then to the iron in Evelyn's hand. The heat radiating from it was visible in the air, a shimmer of danger. "I knocked," Boone said evenly. "Your cook told me to come around back. Now I'm asking you to put that iron down." Evelyn's lip curled. "This is none of your concern, Mountain Man. This girl is a thief. She stole from me, and she'll be marked for it so everyone knows what she is. What did she steal?" Boone asked, not moving from where he stood. "My mother's locket." Evelyn's voice rose to a shriek. "A gold locket worth more than this worthless creature will earn in her lifetime." Mara's voice came out choked and desperate. "I didn't take it, ma'am. I swear on my mother's grave I never touched it. Liar!" Evelyn raised the iron higher, her arm trembling with fury. "I found it in your room, hidden under your mattress. You thought you could sell it, didn't you? Thought you could steal from me and run." Boone took a step forward. "Put the iron down, Mrs. Cartwright." Evelyn turned on him, her eyes wild. "Get out of my house. This is my property, my servant, and my right." "No, ma'am," Boone said quietly. "It's not your right to harm another human being. Not in any house, not in any territory, not anywhere on God's earth. Who do you think you are?" Evelyn's voice dripped with contempt. "You're nobody. A dirty hermit who lives in the woods like an animal. You have no authority here." Boone's jaw tightened. "I'm a man who's seen enough cruelty in this world to know it when I see it. And I'm telling you one last time, lay that iron down, or I swear you'll answer to me." For a moment the only sound in the room was the crackle of the fire and Mara's quiet sobbing. Evelyn's face went from red to pale, her hand shaking as she held the iron. She was a woman used to being obeyed, used to her word being law. No one had ever challenged her like this, certainly not some common laborer. But as she looked into Boone's eyes, she saw something that made her hesitate. It wasn't anger she saw there, or even hatred. It was something colder and more certain, a quiet promise that he would do exactly what he said. Slowly, Evelyn lowered the iron, but she didn't set it down. Instead, she placed it on the edge of the kitchen table, still within reach. "Fine," she said, her voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "Take her, then. Take the little thief. But know this, Boone. You've just made an enemy of the most powerful family in this valley. You'll regret this. I promise you that. Boone walked past Evelyn to where Mara huddled against the wall. He knelt down beside her, keeping his movements slow and gentle. "Can you stand?" he asked softly. Mara nodded, though her whole body was trembling. Boone helped her to her feet, steadying her when her legs threatened to give out. Up close, he could see the marks of old bruises fading on her neck, and fresh ones forming where Evelyn had struck her. "Get your things," Boone said. "Whatever you need. You're leaving this place." Mara stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "But where will I go? I have nothing. No money, no—" "You're coming with me," Boone said. "Up to my cabin. You'll be safe there." "You can't," Evelyn said, her voice low and dangerous. "She's under contract to work here. If she leaves, she's in breach. I can have the sheriff arrest her." Boone turned to face Evelyn. "No contract in the world gives you the right to brand a woman's face with hot iron. You tried to bring the law into this, and I'll make sure every person in Red Hollow knows exactly what you were about to do. You think your reputation will survive that?" Evelyn's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time, doubt flickered across her face. Boone looked back at Mara. "Go on. Get your things." Mara hesitated only a moment longer, then hurried from the kitchen. Boone could hear her footsteps on the stairs, quick and light. He and Evelyn stood in silence, neither moving. The iron on the table began to cool, its glow fading from red to orange to dull gray. "You'll pay for this," Evelyn said finally, her voice like ice. "Both of you." "Maybe so," Boone replied. "But not today." Mara returned a few minutes later with a small cloth bag containing what Boone guessed was everything she owned in the world. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was something else there now, a spark of hope, fragile but real. Boone guided her toward the door, keeping himself between her and Evelyn. As they stepped outside into the cold, he heard Evelyn's voice one last time, carrying through the open doorway. "This isn't over, Boone." He didn't respond. He helped Mara up onto the wagon seat, then climbed up beside her. The mules shifted in their harnesses, eager to be moving. Boone released the brake and snapped the reins gently. As they pulled away from the Cartwright mansion, Boone glanced at Mara. She sat rigid, her hands clutched around her bag, her eyes fixed straight ahead. A single tear rolled down her cheek, but she made no sound. "You're safe now," Boone said quietly. Mara turned to look at him, and in her eyes, he saw something he recognized, the look of someone who'd been drowning and had just been pulled above water, gasping and disbelieving that they might actually survive. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you risk everything for me?" Boone was quiet for a moment, guiding the mules down the hill toward the main street. "Because it was the right thing to do," he said finally. "And because I've seen what happens when good people do nothing." They passed through town in the fading afternoon light. Faces appeared in windows, watching them go. By the time Boone turned the wagon onto the mountain road, he knew the story would already be spreading through Red Hollow like wildfire. The mountain man had taken Evelyn Cartwright's maid, had stolen her right out of the house, some would say, had rescued her, others might whisper, when they thought no one was listening. Either way, Calder Boone had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. And in the warmth of her mansion, with rage burning in her heart like that cooling iron, Evelyn Cartwright was already planning her revenge. The journey up the mountain took 3 hours in good weather. In winter, with snow on the ground and the light fading fast, it took longer. Boone kept the mules to a steady pace, not pushing them hard, but not dawdling either. Beside him, Mara sat wrapped in a blanket he'd pulled from behind the seat, but she still shivered in the cold. She hadn't spoken since they'd left town, and Boone didn't press her. He'd seen that kind of shock before, in soldiers after their first battle, in civilians whose homes had been burned. The mind needed time to catch up with what the body had been through. The road climbed through stands of pine and aspen, winding back and forth up the mountainside. As they rose higher, the air grew thinner and colder, and the snow lay deeper. The sun dropped toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Finally, as full darkness settled over the mountains, Boone guided the wagon off the main road onto a smaller track that led through the trees. After another half-mile, they emerged into a clearing. There stood his cabin, dark and silent, with the small barn beside it. "We're here," Boone said. Mara looked at the cabin, then at him. "This is where you live?" "For the past 7 years," Boone said. He climbed down from the wagon and came around to help her. She took his hand. It was the first time she'd touched him willingly, and let him steady her as she stepped onto the frozen ground. "Wait here a moment," Boone said. He walked to the cabin door, unlocked it, and went inside. A minute later, warm light spilled from the windows as he lit the lamps. He came back out and gestured. "Come on in. It's not much, but it's warm." Mara followed him inside, still clutching her bag. The cabin was indeed small, but it was clean and well kept. The stone fireplace dominated one wall, and Boone quickly set about building a fire. Within minutes, flames crackled and heat began to fill the space. "Sit," Boone said, indicating the chair near the fire. "I need to tend to the mules, but I'll be back shortly." Mara sat, and Boone went back outside. He unhitched the mules and led them to the barn, gave them hay and water, and checked on the cow. His breath steamed in the frigid air, and his hands ached from the cold. But the familiar routine settled his mind. When he returned to the cabin, Mara was still sitting in the chair, staring into the flames. Boone hung his coat on a peg by the door and rolled up his sleeves. "Let me see your arms," he said gently. Mara looked up at him, startled. "What, your arms?" "Where she hit you. I need to see if anything's broken." Slowly, Mara extended her arms. The bruises were already darkening, purple and black against her pale skin. Boone examined them carefully, his touch light. He'd set enough broken bones during the war to know what he was looking for. "Nothing broken," he said after a moment. "But those bruises are going to hurt for a while." He went to a shelf and took down a small tin. "This is a salve I make from pine sap and herbs. It'll help with the pain and the swelling." He knelt beside her chair and gently applied the salve to her arms. Mara winced at first, then relaxed as the medicine began to work. When he was finished, Boone stood and went to the stove. "You need to eat something," he said. "When did you last have a meal?" "Yesterday morning," Mara said quietly. Boone's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He built up the fire in the stove and put on a pot of stew he'd made 2 days before. As it warmed, he sliced bread and set out butter and honey. They ate in silence, Mara devouring the food as though she hadn't eaten in days, which Boone realized she probably hadn't. When she'd finished, some color had returned to her cheeks, and her hands had stopped shaking quite so much. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Boone nodded. "You're welcome." He cleared the dishes and then turned to face her. "I need to ask you some questions. Not because I don't believe you, but because I need to understand what happened. Can you tell me about the locket?" Mara's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "It's a brass locket," she said. "Not gold, brass. It belonged to my mother. She gave it to me before she died 6 years ago. It's the only thing I have left of her. And Mrs. Cartwright claimed it was hers. Yes, she said it was her mother's, that it was gold and worth a fortune. But it's not. It's just brass with a picture of my parents inside. I kept it hidden in my room because I was afraid someone might take it." Her voice broke. "She must have searched my things. She found it and decided to use it as an excuse." "An excuse for what?" Boone asked, though he thought he already knew the answer. "To get rid of me," Mara said. "I've been there 3 years, and every day she finds some new reason to punish me. At first, I thought if I just worked harder, kept my head down, she'd leave me alone. But it only got worse. The other servants told me she's been like this with every maid she's had. She hires them, uses them, breaks them, and then drives them away. I think she enjoys it." Boone pulled a chair over and sat across from her. "Why didn't you leave?" Mara laughed, a bitter sound. "And go where? Do what? I have no family, no money, and no references without her say-so. Every other household in Red Hollow knows what she's like, and they won't hire anyone who's worked for her because they don't want her anger turned on them. I was trapped." "You're not trapped anymore," Boone said. Mara looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. "Why did you help me? You don't know me. You have no reason to make an enemy of the Cartwrights." Boone was quiet for a moment, his gaze distant. When he spoke, his voice was soft. "I was at a place called Fredericksburg during the war, a town that got caught between 2 armies. I saw things there, things done to people who couldn't defend themselves. Civilians, families, women and children. I saw men in uniform stand by and do nothing because it wasn't their concern, or because they were following orders, or because they were too afraid. He looked back at Mara. I made myself a promise that day. If I survived the war, I'd never stand by again. I'd never look away when someone needed help, no matter what it cost me. So when I walked into that kitchen and saw what Mrs. Cartwright was about to do to you, there was no choice to make. There was only what was right. Mara's eyes were wet with tears now, but she didn't look away. I don't know how to thank you. You don't need to thank me, Boone said. You just need to rest and heal. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next. He stood and moved to a chest in the corner of the room. From it, he pulled out a quilt his wife had made. The pattern faded, but the fabric still warm and soft. You can sleep in the bed, he said. I'll take the floor by the fire. No, Mara said quickly. I can't take your bed. You've already done so much. The bed is yours, Boone said firmly. I've slept on harder ground than this floor, believe me. Now you should rest. You're safe here. No one's going to hurt you. Mara stood, clutching the quilt. She hesitated, then said, Mr. Boone, Just Boone, he interrupted gently. No need for Mr. Boone, she said, testing the name. Will they come after us? The Cartwrights. Boone met her eyes. I don't know, maybe. But if they do, they'll have to go through me first. There was something in the way he said it, a quiet certainty that made Mara believe him. She nodded, then walked to the bed and lay down, pulling the quilt up to her chin. Within minutes, exhausted from fear and shock and the long journey, she fell into a deep sleep. Boone banked the fire, spread his own blanket on the floor, and lay down. But sleep didn't come easily. His mind turned over the events of the day, weighing the choices he'd made and the consequences that would surely follow. He'd taken Mara from the Cartwrights. In doing so, he'd challenged the most powerful family in the territory. Evelyn Cartwright wasn't the type to let such an insult go unanswered. She would come for him one way or another. The question wasn't if, but when, and in what form her revenge would take. But as Boone lay there in the darkness, listening to the wind in the pines outside and the soft sound of Mara's breathing, he found that he didn't regret what he'd done. Not even a little. Some things were worth fighting for. Some things were worth the cost, and the look in Mara's eyes when she'd realized she was finally safe. That was one of them. The days that followed took on a quiet rhythm. Boone rose before dawn, as he always did, and set about his morning chores, feeding the animals, splitting wood, checking his traps in the forest. Mara slept late those first few days, her body demanding the rest it had been denied for so long. When she did wake, she'd find a simple breakfast waiting for her on the table, cornmeal porridge, or eggs from the chickens Boone kept, or thick slices of bread with butter. At first, she ate in silence, still uncertain of her place in this strange new world. But gradually she began to relax. On the third morning, Boone came in from the cold to find Mara standing at the stove, stirring a pot of oatmeal. She turned when she heard the door, her expression almost guilty. I hope you don't mind, she said quickly. I thought I could at least cook breakfast. You've done so much, and I don't mind, Boone said, hanging his coat by the door. But you don't owe me anything, Mara. You're not a servant here. Mara's hand tightened on the wooden spoon. Then what am I? It was a fair question, and Boone considered it as he washed his hands in the basin. You're someone who needed help, he said finally. And now you're someone who's getting back on her feet. That's all. They ate together, and afterward, Boone showed her how to care for the animals. Mara had grown up in a city, St. Louis, she told him, and had never been close to livestock before. The cow made her nervous at first, and the chickens startled her with their sudden movements. But she was a quick learner, and by the end of the week she could milk the cow and gather eggs without Boone's help. In the evenings, they sat by the fire. Sometimes Boone would read aloud from one of his books. He had a small collection, mostly histories and poetry that Sarah had loved. Other times they simply talked. Boone learned that Mara had come west after her parents died, hoping to start fresh. She'd worked as a seamstress for a while, then as a shop girl, before taking the position at the Cartwright house. She had a younger brother somewhere in California, but they'd lost touch years ago. I wrote to him once I got to Red Hollow, Mara said one evening. But the letter came back. Addressee unknown. I don't know if he moved or if something happened to him. I've been looking for him ever since, but it's like he vanished. California's a big place, Boone said. But that doesn't mean you won't find him. Sometimes people are just harder to track down than we'd like. Mara smiled sadly. Maybe, or maybe he doesn't want to be found. We didn't part on the best terms. He wanted to go to the goldfields, and I told him he was a fool. We fought about it, said things we shouldn't have. And then he left, and I never saw him again. Boone understood the weight of regret. He carried his own share of it, words left unsaid, moments he'd wasted, choices he couldn't take back. One afternoon, as Boone was carving a new handle for an axe, Mara asked him about the journal on the shelf. He'd seen her looking at it more than once, curiosity evident in her eyes. It belonged to my wife, Boone said, not looking up from his work. Well, she gave it to me, but it was hers first. You were married? For 5 years. Sarah was her name. She died of fever while I was away at the war. By the time I got word and made it home, she'd been in the ground 2 months. Mara's face softened with sympathy. I'm so sorry. Boone set down the axe handle. She was a good woman, kind, patient. She deserved better than a husband who was gone more than he was home. He paused, then stood and retrieved the journal from the shelf. Would you like to see it? Mara hesitated, then nodded. Boone handed her the journal, and she opened it carefully as though it might break. Inside were his sketches, wildflowers, trees, landscapes. And pressed between the pages, the dried flowers Sarah had picked. These are beautiful, Mara said softly, tracing a finger over a sketch of a mountain laurel. You drew these? In the quiet moments, Boone said. It helped to have something to do with my hands, besides hold a rifle. Something that created instead of destroyed. Mara turned another page and found a pressed flower, its petals faded to pale yellow. And these? Sarah picked those the summer before I left for the war. She loved wildflowers, said they were proof that beauty could grow anywhere, even in the hardest ground. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, Mara gently turning the pages. Finally, she closed the journal and handed it back to him. Thank you for showing me, she said. It's clear you loved her very much. I did, Boone said simply. Still do, I suppose. But that was a long time ago, and the world keeps turning whether we're ready or not. As the days passed, Boone noticed changes in Mara. The haunted look began to fade from her eyes. She smiled more often, and sometimes he even heard her humming as she worked. The bruises on her arms turned from purple to green to yellow, and then faded altogether. One morning, Boone was outside chopping wood when he heard the crack of a rifle shot. He dropped the axe and ran toward the cabin, his heart pounding. But when he burst through the door, he found Mara standing by the window, his old hunting rifle in her hands, a look of amazement on her face. I hit it, she said, her voice full of wonder. The tin can on the fence post. I actually hit it. Boone let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. You nearly gave me heart failure, woman. What are you doing with my rifle? Mara's smile faded. I'm sorry. I should have asked. I was looking at it this morning, and I thought maybe I should learn how to use it. In case... She stopped, not finishing the thought. In case the Cartwrights come. That's what she meant, and they both knew it. Boone walked over and gently took the rifle from her hands. If you want to learn to shoot, I'll teach you proper. But not inside the cabin, and not without telling me first. Agreed, Mara nodded. Agreed. And so, in the afternoons when his work was done, Boone began teaching Mara to shoot. They set up targets in the clearing, tin cans, pieces of wood with circles drawn on them. At first, her shots went wide, the recoil of the rifle surprising her. But Boone was patient, showing her how to hold the weapon steady, how to breathe, how to squeeze the trigger instead of pulling it. Within a week, she was hitting the targets more often than not. You're a natural, Boone said one afternoon. After Mara had hit 3 cans in a row, Mara lowered the rifle, a pleased smile on her face. I like it. It makes me feel, I don't know, strong, I guess. Like I'm not helpless anymore. You were never helpless, Boone said. You survived 3 years in that house. That takes more strength than most people ever have to show. That night, as they sat by the fire, Mara asked the question that had been hovering between them for days. "What happens next, Boone? I can't stay here forever." "Why not?" Boone asked. Mara blinked. Because it's your home. Because people will talk. Because people are already talking," Boone said. "And as for this being my home, it's plenty big enough for two. You're welcome to stay as long as you like. Through the winter, at least. Come spring, if you want to move on, I'll help you however I can. But there's no rush." Mara studied him in the firelight. "Why are you being so kind to me?" Boone shrugged. "Maybe because I've been alone up here for 7 years, and it's nice to have someone to talk to. Or maybe because I figure everyone deserves a chance to start over, and you never got yours." "Does it matter?" "I suppose not," Mara said quietly. Then after a pause, "Thank you, Boone, for everything." He nodded, and they sat in comfortable silence until the fire burned low and it was time for sleep. But that night, as Boone lay on his blanket by the hearth, he found himself thinking about what Mara had asked. What happens next? He didn't know the answer, not really. He only knew that for the first time in years, the cabin didn't feel quite so empty. And when he woke in the morning to find Mara already up and making coffee, humming softly to herself, he realized that maybe some things were worth the risk of change, even if that change brought trouble with it. February came with heavy snows that piled high against the cabin walls and made travel down the mountain impossible. Boone didn't mind. He had plenty of provisions, and the work of keeping the cabin warm and the animals fed gave structure to the days. Mara had settled into life on the mountain with a grace that surprised him. She took on tasks without being asked, mending his clothes, organizing the shelves, even helping him tan the hides from the deer he'd taken in the fall. She was stronger than she looked, and more resilient than she probably knew. One evening, as a storm howled outside and they sat close to the fire for warmth, Mara asked him about the war. "You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to," she said quickly. "I'm just curious. You mentioned Fredericksburg once, and I wondered, what was it like? The war, I mean." Boone was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames. Most people who asked about the war wanted glory stories, tales of heroism and victory. But Mara's question felt different, more genuine. "It was loud," he said finally. "That's the first thing I remember. The constant noise, cannons, rifles, men shouting, horses screaming, and the smell, smoke and blood and things burning that shouldn't burn. After a while you got used to it, which is maybe the worst part. You got used to horror." Mara listened without interrupting. "I was at Shiloh," Boone continued. "That was my first real battle. I was 23 years old, thought I knew what I was getting into. But nothing prepares you for that. I saw boys, and they were boys, some of them not even 18, cut down before they'd fired a single shot. I carried a man named Thomas Mallory 1/2 mile to the surgeon's tent, and he died in my arms before we got there. He kept asking for his mother, over and over. 'Tell her I was brave. Tell her I was brave.' I never even knew his mother's name." He paused, his jaw working. "After Shiloh, I was different. We all were. You realize how cheap life is when you see hundreds of men dying for a piece of ground that doesn't even have a name. But you keep fighting because that's what you signed up to do, and because the men beside you are depending on you, and because if you stop to think too hard about any of it, you'll go mad. How did you survive it?" Mara asked softly. "Not just physically, but in here?" She touched her chest over her heart. Boone looked at her. "Sarah. I held on because of Sarah. Every time I thought I couldn't take another day, I'd pull out her letters and read them. She wrote to me every week, told me about the farm, about the neighbors, about her garden. Normal things, beautiful things. She reminded me there was still a world worth saving. She sounds like a remarkable woman." "She was," Boone said. "She kept me human when everything around me was trying to make me into something else. Something hard and cold and dead inside." He reached up and pulled a chain from beneath his shirt. On it hung a simple gold ring. This was hers. Her wedding ring. I've worn it since the day I buried her. Some men might call that morbid, but to me it's a reminder. A reminder that I loved someone once, that I was capable of it. That I'm not just— He stopped, searching for words. Not just what? Mara prompted gently. Not just a man who knows how to survive, Boone said. Not just a man who knows how to fight. I'm also a man who knows how to love and care and protect what matters. Sarah taught me that, and I carry her with me so I never forget. Mara's eyes were bright with unshed tears. Do you think— She hesitated. Do you think you could ever love someone again? After losing her? It was a bold question, and Boone knew there was more behind it than simple curiosity. He chose his words carefully. I think, he said slowly, that love isn't something that runs out. It's not like you get one chance and that's it. But I also think that when you love someone as much as I loved Sarah, losing them changes you, makes you cautious, makes you wonder if you could survive going through that kind of pain again. But you could, Mara said. It wasn't a question. Maybe, Boone admitted. If the right person came along? If I was brave enough to try. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters, but inside, the cabin was warm and safe. Boone, Mara said eventually. Can I tell you something? Of course. When I was at the Cartwright house, I used to pray every night that something would change, that someone would see what was happening and help me. But as time went on, I stopped praying because I stopped believing anyone would. I started to think that maybe I deserved it somehow, that maybe there was something wrong with me, something that made me worthy of that kind of treatment. Her voice wavered, but she pushed on. But then you walked in, and you didn't even know me, but you stood up for me anyway. You risked everything for a stranger, and it made me realize that I was wrong. I didn't deserve what Evelyn did to me. No one deserves that. She turned to face him fully. You gave me back something I'd lost, Boone. You gave me back myself, my sense of worth, my belief that I matter. I don't know how to ever repay that. Boone shook his head. You don't need to repay anything. Seeing you smile again, hearing you laugh, that's enough. Mara reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were small and warm against his rough palm. I want you to know that I see you, Boone. Not just the mountain man, not just the soldier. I see the man who carves handles for axes and draws flowers in a journal. The man who talks to his mules like they're old friends. The man who wears his wife's ring because he still loves her, even though she's gone. Boone felt something tighten in his chest. It had been so long since anyone had truly seen him, had looked past the surface to the man beneath. I see you too, Mara, he said quietly. And what I see is someone stronger than she knows. Someone who survived when others would have broken. Someone who deserves every good thing this world has to offer. They stayed like that, hands clasped, until the fire burned down to embers. And when they finally parted for the night, something had shifted between them. Something neither of them had names for yet, but both of them felt. Down in Red Hollow, the winter had been harsh in different ways. Evelyn Cartwright paced her empty mansion, her fury undiminished by the passing weeks. She'd made inquiries, sent men to ask questions, but no one in town would tell her where Boone's cabin was. Or if they knew, they weren't saying. But Evelyn was patient. She could wait. And when spring came, and the mountain passes cleared, she would send men to bring Mara back. And when they did, she would make sure that both the girl and the mountain man learned what it meant to defy Evelyn Cartwright. Some debts, she thought, could only be paid in blood. The snow began to melt in late February, revealing the brown earth beneath and filling the streams with rushing water. Icicles dripped from the cabin's eaves, and the days grew noticeably longer. Boone knew that within a few weeks the mountain roads would be passable again, and when they were, people would come. He didn't share his concerns with Mara right away. She'd grown so much more confident in recent weeks, so much more herself. She laughed easily now, and sometimes he'd catch her singing as she worked. It reminded him of Sarah, though Mara was different in nearly every other way. Where Sarah had been gentle and soft-spoken, Mara had a sharp wit and a directness that sometimes caught him off guard. One morning, as Boone was checking his traps in the forest, he found one of them sprung but empty. The snow around it was disturbed, and he could see where something large, a wolf perhaps, had been digging. But what caught his attention were the boot prints nearby. Human boot prints, and fresh. Someone had been on his land. Boone followed the tracks for a quarter-mile before they disappeared into a rocky area where the snow had melted. Whoever it was had been careful, staying off the main paths, moving through the trees like they knew what they were doing. He returned to the cabin more troubled than he'd been in weeks. Mara noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked. Boone debated not telling her, but he'd never believed in keeping people in the dark for their own good. "Someone's been in the woods near here. Could be a trapper, could be someone just passing through. But I want you to be careful when you're outside. Don't wander far from the cabin." Mara's face went pale. "You think it's them?" "The Cartwrights." "I don't know," Boone said honestly. "But I'm not taking chances." That night, Boone pulled his rifle down from above the door and cleaned it thoroughly. He checked his ammunition and made sure his pistol was loaded. Mara watched him from the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea. "I'm scared," she admitted. "I know," Boone said. "But fear's not always a bad thing. Keeps you alert. Keeps you smart. Will you teach me more?" Mara asked. "With the rifle, I mean. I want to be ready if something happens." So the next day, despite his unease, Boone took Mara out to practice. But instead of the usual target shooting, he taught her different things. How to reload quickly, how to shoot from cover, how to stay calm when your heart was racing. The first rule, he told her, is that you don't shoot unless you have to. But if you have to, you don't hesitate. Understood? Mara nodded, her face serious. As they walked back to the cabin that afternoon, Mara said, "Tell me about the flower." "What flower?" "In your journal. The pressed one that's faded to yellow. You said Sarah picked it, but you didn't say why." Boone was quiet for a moment. "It was the last flower she ever picked, the day before I left for the war. We walked up into the meadow above the farm, and she saw that flower growing near a stream. She said it was a buttercup, said it meant happiness. She picked it and gave it to me and told me to keep it, so I'd have something beautiful to look at even in ugly times." "Did it help?" Mara asked. "More than I can say," Boone replied. "There were nights when I'd pull out that journal and look at that flower, and it was like Sarah was there with me, reminding me what I was fighting for." They walked in silence for a bit, their boots crunching on the wet snow. Then Mara said, "I don't have anything like that. No pressed flower, no token. I don't even have a good memory of my parents that isn't tinged with sadness." "Then make new memories," Boone said. "Better ones. That's what life's about, isn't it? Not forgetting the past, but not being trapped by it either." Mara stopped walking and turned to face him. "Is that what you're doing up here? Making new memories?" Boone met her eyes. "I'm trying to. Some days are easier than others. And me being here, does that help or hurt?" It was a vulnerable question, and Boone knew his answer mattered. "It helps," he said simply. "More than you know." Mara smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Good, because you've helped me more than I can ever say." That evening, as they prepared dinner together, a routine they'd fallen into without discussion, Mara asked, "What will you do when spring really comes?" "When the roads are clear, keep living," Boone said. "Keep working. Same as always. And me?" Boone set down the knife he'd been using to cut vegetables. "That's up to you, Mara. You're welcome to stay here as long as you want. Or if you want to go somewhere else, start over somewhere new, I'll help you do that. I'll give you money, supplies, whatever you need. But the choice is yours. What if I don't know what I want? Then take your time figuring it out. There's no rush." But even as he said it, Boone knew it wasn't entirely true. There was a clock ticking somewhere, counting down to something neither of them could quite see yet. The tracks in the snow had reminded him of that. After dinner, Mara took down Boone's journal from the shelf. "May I?" she asked. Boone nodded. She opened it carefully, turning through the pages of sketches. When she reached the pressed buttercup, she studied it for a long time. "It's still beautiful," she said softly. "Even faded. Maybe especially faded. It survived, just like you have." "Just like we both have," Boone corrected. Mara looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw something that made his breath catch. It was a look he hadn't seen in a long time, not since Sarah. A look that spoke of trust and affection and the possibility of something more. "Boone," she said quietly, I think I'm starting to feel—" She stopped, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence. But Boone understood. He felt it too, this growing connection between them. It scared him, if he was being honest. Scared him because he knew what it was like to lose someone he loved, and he wasn't sure he could survive that kind of pain again. But it also filled him with something he'd thought was lost forever. Hope. "I know," he said gently. "I feel it too." They stayed up late that night, talking about everything and nothing. And when they finally said goodnight and went to their respective sleeping places, Boone lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling. Change was coming. He could feel it in the air, in the melt of the snow, in the way Mara looked at him. Whether that change would be good or bad, he couldn't say. But he knew one thing for certain. Whatever came, he would face it. And he wouldn't face it alone. The stranger arrived on a grey morning when the fog lay thick in the valley below. Boone heard the horse before he saw it, the steady clip of hooves on the muddy trail. He set down the wood he'd been stacking and reached for the rifle he now kept close at hand. Mara emerged from the cabin, her face tense. "Who is it?" "Don't know yet," Boone said. "Get back inside." But before Mara could move, the rider emerged from the fog. He was a tall man, perhaps 60 years old, with a grey beard and military bearing. He rode a good horse and wore a long coat that had seen better days. When he saw Boone standing with the rifle, he raised both hands, showing he was unarmed. "Easy, Sergeant," the man called out. "I come in peace." Boone's eyes narrowed. "Who are you?" The man dismounted slowly, keeping his hands visible. "Colonel James Hartford. We served together at Chattanooga. You pulled me out of a burning building after the shelling. Saved my life." Recognition sparked in Boone's memory. Hartford. Yes, he remembered now. A company commander. Good man, fair but demanding. They'd fought side by side during the Atlanta campaign. "Colonel," Boone said, lowering the rifle slightly. "It's been a long time. 10 years, Hartford agreed. He looked older than Boone remembered. Worn down by time and whatever he'd done since the war. "I apologize for showing up unannounced, but I need to speak with you." "It's urgent." Boone glanced at Mara, who stood in the doorway. "All right. Come inside." They settled around the table and Mara poured coffee. Hartford took a long drink, then set down his cup and looked at Boone with serious eyes. "I'm going to be direct," Hartford said. "You're in danger. Both of you." "I figured as much," Boone replied. "Evelyn Cartwright isn't the forgiving type." "It's worse than you think," Hartford said. "I've been living in Red Hollow for the past month trying to keep a low profile. I heard about what happened with you and the girl, and I started asking questions. Turns out Mrs. Cartwright has put up a considerable sum of money to hire men to come up here and bring Miss Flynn back. And when I say men, I don't mean ranch hands. I mean professional guns, killers." Mara's face went white. "How many?" "6 that I know of," Hartford said. "They're waiting for the passes to clear. Should be any day now." Boone's jaw tightened. "Why are you telling me this?" Hartford looked at him steadily. "Because you saved my life once, and I owe you. And because—" he paused. "Because I know who you really are, Boone. Or should I say, sentinel." The word hung in the air like a thunderclap. Mara looked between them, confused. "Sentinel? What does that mean?" Boone's face had gone hard as stone. "Where did you hear that name?" "From a captain I served with after the war," Hartford said. "He was with you at Fredericksburg. He told me about a sergeant who'd earned a reputation for protecting civilians caught in the war zone. They called him the Sentinel because he was like a watchman, always alert, always ready to stand between innocent people and harm. He said this sergeant single-handedly held off a Confederate raiding party that was about to massacre a family hiding in a church. Killed 3 men, wounded 2 more, and drove the rest off." Hartford leaned forward. "The captain showed me a sketch someone had drawn of this sentinel. I recognized you immediately, though I'd never connected the quiet sergeant I knew with the legend others told about. You never talked about it, never sought glory for what you'd done. But people remembered you, Boone. The civilians you saved, the soldiers who fought beside you. They remembered." Mara was staring at Boone with wide eyes. "Is this true?" Boone didn't answer right away. Finally he said, "That was a long time ago. A different war, a different man, was it? Hartford asked gently. Because from what I've seen, you're still the same man. Still standing up for those who can't defend themselves. Still putting yourself between danger and the innocent. What's your point, Colonel? My point, Hartford said, is that 6 hired guns are coming for you. And while I have no doubt you're still capable, you're not the young soldier you were during the war. You're older, you're alone, and you're protecting someone who's untrained in combat. The odds aren't good, so what do you suggest? Boone asked. Hartford smiled. I suggest you stop being alone. I've tracked down 3 other men from our old unit. They're in the area, and they're willing to help. They owe you, Boone, we all do. I don't need— Yes, you do, Hartford interrupted. Pride's a luxury you can't afford right now. Not with her life on the line. He nodded toward Mara. Boone looked at Mara, saw the fear in her eyes, but also the determination. She'd come so far, grown so strong. He couldn't let her be dragged back to that hell. All right, he said finally. Tell me about these men. Hartford pulled a folded paper from his coat. Lieutenant Samuel Cross, you remember him? Best tracker in the unit. He's been working as a guide for hunting parties up north. Then there's Corporal Jack Morrison, a crack shot with a rifle, and Private Tom Whitaker, who can rig traps and defenses like nobody's business. I remember them, Boone said. Good men, all of them. But why are they here? I've been looking for them for months, Hartford admitted. After I heard what you did in Red Hollow, I knew trouble was coming. I thought maybe we could all help. We're all older now, all carrying our own ghosts from the war. But maybe, just maybe, we've got one more fight in us. One more chance to do something right. Mara spoke up, her voice shaking slightly. I don't want anyone else to get hurt because of me. Hartford turned to her with kind eyes. Miss, with all due respect, this stopped being just about you the moment Evelyn Cartwright hired killers. This is about standing against people who think they can do whatever they want just because they have money and power. It's about justice. And that's worth fighting for. Boone stood and walked to the window, looking out at the mountains. Hartford was right, the odds weren't good. But with help, with men he could trust, maybe they had a chance. When can your men get here? He asked. They're already close, Hartford said. I can have them here by tomorrow. Boone nodded slowly. Then bring them. And Colonel, thank you. Hartford stood and offered his hand. Boone shook it. Thank me when this is over, Hartford said. For now, we need to prepare, because those guns won't wait much longer. After Hartford left, Mara turned to Boone. Why didn't you tell me? About being the sentinel. Because it doesn't matter, Boone said. That was war, killing the enemy. This is different, is it? Mara asked. Because it seems to me like you're doing the exact same thing you did back then. Protecting people, standing up to evil. Boone met her eyes. If you're asking if I'll fight to keep you safe, the answer is yes. Without hesitation, Mara crossed the room and took his hands. I don't want you to die for me, Boone. Then we'll have to make sure I don't, he said with a slight smile. Besides, I've got help coming now. That gives us better odds. But as night fell, and Boone lay on his blanket by the fire, he couldn't shake the weight of what was coming. He'd left the war behind years ago, left the killing and the blood. He'd built a quiet life in these mountains, a life of solitude and peace. But peace, it seemed, was a fragile thing. And sometimes, to keep it, you had to be willing to fight. He reached up and touched the ring hanging from the chain around his neck. Sarah's ring. What would she think of all this? Would she understand? Would she approve? He thought she would. Sarah had always believed in doing what was right, no matter the cost. And keeping Mara safe, keeping her from being dragged back to a life of cruelty and pain, that was the right thing to do. The Sentinel. He hadn't heard that name in a decade, hadn't wanted to hear it again. But if that's what it took to protect Mara, then so be it. He would be the Sentinel one more time. Hartford returned the next afternoon with 3 men, just as he'd promised. They rode up through the slush and mud, their horses tired but their eyes alert. Boone watched them approach from the cabin porch, Mara standing beside him. The first man off his horse was Samuel Cross, lean and weathered, with the sharp eyes of a man who missed nothing. He grinned when he saw Boone. "Well, Sergeant, you picked yourself a hell of a spot to make a stand." "Sam," Boone said, gripping his hand. "Good to see you." "You too. Though I'd have preferred it under better circumstances." Jack Morrison dismounted next, a stocky man with greying red hair and arms like tree trunks. He carried a rifle case slung across his back. "Still getting yourself into trouble, I see," he said to Boone. "Some things don't change." Jack, Tom Whitaker was the last down, younger than the others, maybe 35, with a quiet demeanor that hid a sharp, tactical mind. He nodded to Boone. "Sergeant, Tom, thank you all for coming." Hartford gathered them all inside, and they crowded around the small table while Mara served coffee. She was nervous. Boone could see it in the way her hands shook slightly as she poured, but she held herself together. "All right," Hartford said, spreading a hand-drawn map on the table. "Here's what we know. 6 hired guns led by a man named Carson Blake. He's got a reputation. Former Confederate guerrilla, the kind who didn't stop fighting when the war ended. He's brutal, effective, and he doesn't take prisoners." "Cheerful," Jack muttered. Hartford continued. "They're planning to come up the main trail, probably in 2 groups. They'll want to box Boone in, cut off escape routes. The question is when." "Soon," Sam said. "Weather's clearing. If I were Blake, I'd move within the next 2 days, before the mud dries and makes tracking harder." Boone studied the map. "This cabin's defensible, but only up to a point. We're outnumbered. If they get us pinned inside, it's over, so we don't let them pin us," Tom said. "We need traps, fallbacks, ways to control how they approach." "Show me," Boone said. They spent the next several hours planning. Tom sketched out a defensive perimeter around the cabin, tripwires, warning bells made from tin cans, and deadfall traps that could slow or injure attackers. Sam identified the best vantage points for spotting anyone approaching. Jack checked everyone's weapons and ammunition. Boone led them into the woods behind the cabin, where he'd buried a wooden chest years ago. Inside were the remnants of his military service, a newer rifle, a pistol, extra ammunition, and a few other supplies he'd hoped never to need again. "You've been holding out on us," Jack said, admiring the rifle. "Just being prepared," Boone replied. They worked through the afternoon and into the evening, fortifying the cabin and setting up their defenses. Mara helped where she could, and Boone noticed how the other men treated her with respect and courtesy, never making her feel like a burden. As night fell, they gathered inside. Hartford produced a bottle of whiskey and poured small measures for everyone, including Mara. "To old friends," he said, raising his glass. "And new ones," Sam added. Nodding to Mara, they drank and the liquor warmed Boone's chest. For a moment he was back in a different time, surrounded by brothers in arms, facing impossible odds. It felt both familiar and strange. After the others had settled in for the night, spreading bedrolls on the floor, taking turns on watch, Boone stepped outside. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant overhead. He heard the cabin door open behind him and knew without looking that it was Mara. "Can't sleep?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. "Too much on my mind." "Boone, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." He turned to face her. "All right, what are our chances?" "Really?" Boone considered lying, softening the truth, but he'd promised honesty. "Better than they were. With these men, with the defenses we've set up, we've got a fighting chance. But I won't lie to you, Mara, this is going to be dangerous. People could die. You could—" He stopped, unable to finish the thought. "I could die," Mara finished for him. "I know. I've known since Hartford showed up. But Boone, I want you to understand something. If I have to choose between living the rest of my life in fear, running and hiding, or standing and fighting, even if it costs me everything, I choose to fight. You taught me that. You taught me that I'm worth fighting for." Boone felt his throat tighten. "You are. God, Mara, you're worth more than you know." "So are you," she said softly. She reached up and touched his face, her hand warm against his cold cheek. "I need to tell you something before tomorrow, or whenever they come. I need you to know that these weeks here with you, they've been the happiest of my life. You've shown me kindness I didn't know existed. You've made me feel safe and valued and loved." "Mara, let me finish," she said. "I know you still love Sarah. I know you wear her ring and carry her memory. I'm not asking you to forget her or replace her. But I need you to know that I love you, Boone. I don't know when it happened or how, but I do. And if tomorrow is all we get, I wanted you to know that." Boone stood frozen, her words washing over him like a wave. He'd felt this growing between them, this connection. But hearing her say it made it real in a way that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. Slowly, carefully, he reached up and took the chain from around his neck. Sarah's ring glinted in the starlight. He looked at it for a long moment, then closed his hand around it. "Sarah told me something before I left for the war," he said quietly. "She said, if I die while you're gone, I don't want you to spend your life mourning me. I want you to live, Boone. I want you to be happy. And if you find someone else who makes you feel even a fraction of what we have, don't you dare let her go because of me." He opened his hand and looked at the ring again. "I've been carrying this for 7 years, telling myself I was honoring her memory. But the truth is, I was hiding, using grief as a shield so I wouldn't have to risk feeling this way again. So I wouldn't have to risk losing someone else." He looked up at Mara. "But you're right. These weeks with you, they've made me feel alive again, like I'm more than just a man surviving. You've given me something I thought was lost forever." "What's that?" Mara whispered. "Hope," Boone said. "Hope that there's still good in this world. Hope that second chances are possible. Hope that maybe, just maybe, I can love someone again without dishonoring what I had before." He carefully placed the ring in his pocket, then took both of Mara's hands in his. "I love you too, Mara. I don't know when it happened either, but I do. And I'll be damned if I'm going to let anyone take you away from me." Mara's eyes filled with tears. "Promise me something. Anything. Promise me that no matter what happens, you'll survive this. Because I need you to live, Boone. Even if I don't, I need to know that there's still someone in this world like you. Someone who stands up and fights for what's right. We're both going to survive this," Boone said firmly. "I promise you that." He pulled her close, and she wrapped her arms around him, holding tight. They stood like that for a long time, two people who'd found each other in the darkness, drawing strength from each other for whatever dawn would bring. Inside the cabin, Hartford watched through the window and smiled. He'd seen a lot of men fight for a lot of reasons: duty, honor, revenge. But the strongest fighters, the ones who refused to quit no matter the odds, were the ones fighting for love. And looking at Boone and Mara, he knew they had a chance after all. The next day, they finished their preparations. Tom set the last of the traps. Sam established watch positions. Jack distributed ammunition. And Mara, at Boone's insistence, practiced with the rifle one more time. "Remember," Boone told her, "if it comes to it, you aim for center mass. Don't try to be fancy. Just pull the trigger and keep pulling until the threat stops." "I'll remember," Mara said. As the sun began to set on the second day, Sam came running from his watch position. "They're coming," he said, breathing hard. 6 men, just like Hartford said. "They're about 2 miles out, moving slow." Hartford looked at Boone. "This is it," Boone nodded. "Everyone knows their position." They all confirmed. "Good. Remember, we're not trying to kill them all. We're trying to discourage them, make them realize the cost is too high. If we can do that, they might just turn around. And if they don't?" Jack asked. Boone's face hardened. "Then we do what we have to do." He turned to Mara. "You stay in the cabin. You don't come out unless I call for you, or unless someone breaches the door. Understood?" Mara nodded, though he could see the fear in her eyes. Boone took her face in his hands and kissed her, gentle but firm. "I love you," he said. "Remember that." "I love you too," Mara whispered. "Come back to me." "I will." The men took their positions. Hartford and Sam on the ridge to the east. Jack in the barn with his rifle. Tom at the edge of the tree line. And Boone near the cabin door, his rifle loaded and ready. As darkness fell, they waited. And in that waiting, each man thought about the life that had brought him here, the choices made, the roads taken. They were soldiers again one more time, standing together against the darkness, the sentinel and his brothers, ready for whatever came. The attack came with the last light of day, when shadows stretched long and vision played tricks. Sam's signal, 2 short whistles like a bird call, warned them seconds before the first men appeared on the trail. There were 6 of them, just as Hartford had said. They moved in two groups, 3 approaching from the main trail, 3 circling through the woods to the north. They were professionals. Boone could tell by the way they used cover, by the practiced silence of their movements. Carson Blake led the group on the main trail. Boone recognized him from Hartford's description. Tall, lean, with a scar running down the left side of his face. He carried a rifle with the easy confidence of a man who'd used it many times before. The first trap triggered when Blake was 50 yards from the cabin. A tripwire sent a cascade of tin cans clattering down from the trees. The noise shattered the quiet, and Blake's men dove for cover. "Well," Blake called out, his voice carrying across the clearing, "I see someone's been expecting us." "Mountain Man! Calder Boone! I know you're in there. We're here for the girl. Send her out and we'll leave peaceful like. No one needs to get hurt." Boone didn't respond. He watched from his position, counting men, assessing positions. "I'm told you're a reasonable man," Blake continued. "Former soldier, I hear. So you understand how this works. We've been paid to bring the girl back. That's what we aim to do. You can make this easy or hard. Your choice." Still, Boone said nothing. Blake's patience wore thin. "All right, then. Hard it is." He made a signal and his men began to advance. They moved from tree to tree, using the growing darkness for cover. But Tom's traps did their work. One man stepped on a concealed pressure plate, and a bent sapling whipped up, catching him across the chest and sending him sprawling. Another triggered a deadfall, and logs came tumbling down, forcing him to scramble backward. Hartford and Sam opened fire from the ridge, their shots kicking up dirt near the advancing men. They weren't aiming to kill yet, just to slow them down, make them cautious. But the message was clear. This wouldn't be easy. Blake took cover behind a large pine and called out again. "You've got friends up there, Boone. Smart. But we've got numbers, and we've got time. How long can you hold out?" From the barn, Jack's rifle cracked, and the man beside Blake yelped as a bullet tore through his shoulder. He fell, cursing, clutching the wound. "Long enough!" Boone finally shouted back. "Turn around, Blake. Take your wounded and go. You've been paid for a job, but you haven't been paid enough to die." Blake laughed, a harsh sound. Big words from a man hiding in a cabin. "But I've heard about you, Boone. I know you're the one they called the Sentinel. Think that scares me? That was war. This is business. Then make a business decision," Boone called. "You've already got 1 man wounded. How many more are you willing to lose?" Blake's response was to order his men forward. They came in a rush, firing as they moved. Bullets thudded into the cabin walls, shattered a window, sent splinters flying. Boone returned fire, carefully placing his shots. He clipped 1 man in the leg, sending him down. From the ridge, Hartford and Sam laid down covering fire, forcing Blake's men to duck and weave. But the attackers were determined. They made it to the tree line near the cabin, and Boone could hear them calling to each other, coordinating. Inside the cabin, Mara crouched below the window line, her rifle clutched tight. She heard the gunfire, heard Boone's voice, and every fiber of her being wanted to help. But she remembered his words, "Stay inside," unless he called. Outside, Tom moved through the shadows like a ghost, his knife drawn. He came up behind one of Blake's men, who'd gotten separated from the others, and dispatched him quietly. 4 attackers left. Blake realized they were losing the fight. He pulled back, dragging his wounded with him, and took cover at the edge of the clearing. The gunfire stopped, leaving an eerie quiet broken only by the moaning of the wounded. "This is your last chance, Boone," Blake shouted. "Send the girl out or we burn you out. Your choice." Boone looked toward the ridge where Hartford and Sam waited. In the fading light, he could just make out Hartford's silhouette. The colonel raised his hand in a signal. "Ready, Mara," Boone called. "You all right in there?" "Yes." Her voice came back, shaken but steady. "Stay down." Blake's patience had run out. He gave an order, and one of his men produced a torch, a branch wrapped in cloth soaked in kerosene. He lit it, and the flame flared bright in the darkness. Last chance. Blake called. Boone's answer was a rifle shot that kicked the torch from the man's hand before he could throw it. "So be it," Blake snarled. He turned to his remaining men. "Take them." But as Blake's men prepared for their final assault, something happened that none of them expected. From the woods behind them came a new voice, strong and commanding. "Nobody move." Blake spun, and what he saw made his blood run cold. 3 more men had emerged from the forest, rifles trained on his position. But it wasn't just any 3 men. In the torchlight, Blake could see the lead man clearly, and pinned to his coat was something that made Blake's stomach drop. A yellowed wanted poster. Creased and old, but still recognizable. And on it, sketched in faded ink, was a face Blake knew well. The face of Calder Boone, younger but unmistakable. And above the sketch, in bold letters, "The Sentinel wanted for protection of civilians." It wasn't a criminal warrant. It was something else entirely. A notice put out by grateful families after the war, offering reward money to anyone who could tell them where their savior had gone. Blake had heard stories of the Sentinel, but he'd thought they were just legends. Looking at the man standing before him now, Blake realized the legends were real, and he'd just made a terrible mistake. "Drop your weapons," Hartford commanded, his voice carrying the authority of decades of military service. Behind him, the 3 other veterans kept their rifles steady. Blake's remaining men looked at him uncertain. They were outnumbered now, outflanked, and their element of surprise was gone. One of them, a younger man with fear in his eyes, slowly lowered his rifle. "Don't," Blake hissed. "We were paid for a job." "You were paid to bring back a girl," Hartford interrupted. "What you weren't told is that the woman who hired you, Evelyn Cartwright, has been stealing from her own estate. The ranch you were promised as payment? She doesn't have the authority to give it to you." Blake's eyes narrowed. "You're lying." "Am I?" Hartford reached into his coat and pulled out a document. "I spent the last 2 days in Red Hollow asking questions. Turns out when old Thomas Cartwright died, he left the estate in a trust. Evelyn only has access to income, not the property itself. The actual ownership passes to a nephew back east. She's been embezzling from the trust for years, and when that nephew finds out, and he will, she's going to prison." He held up the document. "This is a letter from the territorial marshal confirming my investigation. You boys have been hired by a woman who can't pay you and is about to be arrested. So I'll ask you again, is this girl worth dying for?" The young man who'd lowered his rifle spoke up. "Mr. Blake, I didn't sign on to die for nothing. If we can't get paid—" "Shut up," Blake snapped. But his voice lacked conviction. Hartford's words had found their mark. Boone emerged from the cabin, his rifle still ready. Behind him, through the doorway, Mara appeared, her own rifle held firmly. In the torchlight, Blake could see the determination in her eyes, the look of someone who decided she was done being a victim. "It's over, Blake," Boone said quietly. "Take your wounded and go, while you still can." For a long moment, Blake stood frozen, rage and calculation warring in his eyes. He'd been promised gold and land. He'd brought 5 men into the mountains. 2 were wounded, 1 was dead. And now he was learning it had all been for nothing. Finally, Blake lowered his rifle. "All right," he said bitterly. "We're done here." "Not quite," Hartford said. He stepped forward and pulled something else from his coat, Mara's mother's locket, the brass one that Evelyn had claimed as her own. "I found this in Evelyn's study when I was searching for documents. It matches the description you gave, Miss Flynn. Your mother's name inside, Catherine Flynn." Mara's hand flew to her mouth. "You found it how?" "When Evelyn realized I was investigating her, she tried to hide evidence. But she missed this. I think she kept it as a trophy, a reminder of her power over you." He walked over and placed it in Mara's hand. "It's yours. It always was." Mara opened the locket with trembling fingers. Inside were 2 small photographs, a man and woman, faded but smiling. Her parents. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched it to her chest. Blake watched this exchange with growing fury. He'd been played, used, and now he was watching his payday evaporate. "Mrs. Cartwright promised us." "Mrs. Cartwright is a liar and a thief," Hartford said flatly. "And when the marshal arrives in Red Hollow tomorrow, she'll face justice. As for you, you've got 2 choices. You can try to finish this job and likely die in the process. Or you can cut your losses and ride away." One of Blake's men, the one Jack had shot in the shoulder, spoke up through gritted teeth. "I'm not dying for this. I'm out, another nodded. Me too. This whole thing's gone wrong. Blake looked at his remaining men and saw the same sentiment reflected in their faces. He'd lost them. The job was done one way or another. Fine, Blake spat. He turned to Boone. But this isn't over, Mountain Man. You've made enemies today. Powerful ones. I've made enemies before, Boone replied. I'm still here. Blake gathered his men and began the painful process of retreating down the mountain. Hartford kept his rifle trained on them until they disappeared into the darkness. Only then did he lower his weapon and let out a long breath. Is it really over? Mara asked, her voice small. For tonight, Hartford said. But yes, Miss Flynn, I believe it is. By tomorrow, everyone in Red Hollow will know the truth about Evelyn Cartwright. Her power is broken. Boone set down his rifle and crossed to Mara. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. She buried her face in his chest and sobbed, tears of relief, of joy, of release from years of fear. The other men gave them space, quietly checking the perimeter and tending to their equipment. As the adrenaline faded, exhaustion set in. Finally, Hartford approached. Boone, about that wanted poster. I know, Boone said, releasing Mara but keeping one arm around her. Where did you get it? Found it in a church in Virginia years ago. The families you saved pooled their money to try to find you, to thank you. But you disappeared. Changed your name, moved west. I kept it, hoping someday I'd track you down. He smiled. Figured it might come in handy tonight. Worked better than I expected. Boone shook his head. I never wanted recognition for any of that. I know. That's what makes you a good man. Hartford clapped him on the shoulder. But sometimes, Boone, it's okay to let people know who you really are. What you've done. The lives you've saved. Maybe, Boone said. He looked at Mara, saw the love and pride in her eyes. Maybe. They spent the night in the cabin, all of them, talking and resting and letting the reality of survival sink in. Sam told stories about their unit during the war. Jack cleaned everyone's weapons one more time. Tom checked his traps and disabled them so no one would get hurt by accident. And Boone sat with Mara, watching her turn the locket over and over in her hands. Her parents' faces smiling up at her from another time. Thank you, she whispered to him. For everything. For standing up for me. For protecting me. For teaching me that I'm worth protecting. You are, Boone said softly. You're worth everything. As dawn broke over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of gold and pink, the crisis had passed. Blake and his men were gone, heading back to whatever holes they'd crawled out of. Evelyn Cartwright's reign of terror was ending, and in a small cabin in the high country, two people who'd found each other in darkness were finally safe to see what their future might hold in the light. Spring came fully to the mountains in the weeks that followed, melting the last of the winter snow and coaxing wildflowers from the warming earth. The meadow near Boone's cabin burst into color, yellows and purples and whites painting the grass like nature's own tapestry. Hartford and his men stayed for a few days, helping to repair the damage from the fight and ensuring no more threats would materialize. But eventually they prepared to move on. They stood outside the cabin on a bright morning, their horses packed and ready. You're welcome to stay, Boone offered. All of you. There's work to be had here and good land if you want to build. Hartford smiled. I appreciate that, Boone. But I think we've all got our own paths to follow. Sam's got family up north he hasn't seen in years. Jack's been offered a job teaching marksmanship at a military academy. Tom's thinking about heading to California, seeing what opportunities are out there. And you? Mara asked. Me, Hartford said thoughtfully. I think I'm going to stay in Red Hollow for a while. Someone needs to make sure justice is properly served. Besides, the town could use a new sheriff. The old one resigned in disgrace when the truth came out about Evelyn. They shook hands all around, and Boone walked them to the edge of the property. Before they left, Hartford turned back one more time. You did good, Boone. The Sentinel would be proud. The Sentinel's retired, Boone said with a slight smile. He's just a mountain man now, is he? Hartford's eyes twinkled. Or maybe he's finally figured out that being a good man and being the Sentinel were always the same thing. He rode off before Boone could respond, and Boone stood watching until they disappeared down the trail. A week later, news reached the cabin that Evelyn Cartwright had been arrested. The territorial marshal had found evidence of years of embezzlement and abuse. She would stand trial, and her victims, including several other former servants who'd come forward after hearing about Mara, would finally have their voices heard. The Cartwright estate was being sold to pay back what Evelyn had stolen, and the proceeds would be distributed to those she'd harmed. It wasn't everything, but it was something. It was justice. Mara received a letter in late April, delivered by a rider from town. Her hands shook as she opened it, and Boone stood beside her, ready to offer support. It was from her brother. "He's alive," Mara breathed, her eyes scanning the page. "He's in Sacramento. He got my letter. It was forwarded from 3 different addresses, but it finally found him, and he wants to see me. He says he's sorry, that he's thought about me every day since we parted." Tears streamed down her face, but these were tears of joy. "Boone, I have a brother again. I have family." "That's wonderful," Boone said, pulling her close. "You should go see him." Mara pulled back, searching his face. "Come with me. We could both go. See California, meet my brother, maybe start fresh somewhere new." Boone looked around the cabin, at the mountains that had been his refuge for so long. He'd built a life here, carved it out of wilderness and solitude. But looking at Mara, at the hope and love in her eyes, he realized something. A life alone was just survival. But a life with someone you loved that was actually living. "All right," he said. "But can we come back sometimes? These mountains, they're part of me." "Of course," Mara said, laughing through her tears. "This will always be home." They spent the next few weeks preparing for the journey. Boone sold some of his equipment, arranged for a neighbor to watch the property, and packed their belongings. On the day before they were set to leave, Mara found Boone in the meadow, kneeling in the grass. She walked over and saw that he was planting something. Small flowers, carefully placed. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Buttercups," Boone said. "Like the one Sarah gave me. I thought maybe it was time to let them grow here, where we've built something new. A way of honoring the past while moving toward the future." Mara knelt beside him and helped, her hands gentle in the earth. When they'd finished planting, Boone pulled the chain from around his neck, the one that had held Sarah's ring for so long. "But the ring wasn't there anymore. I buried it under the flowers," Boone explained. "Right at the roots. Let it rest here. Let it be part of something that grows and lives and continues." "Sarah would have liked that." Mara took his hand. "She would have liked you being happy too." "I am happy," Boone said, looking at her. "For the first time in years, I'm truly happy." They rode out the next morning, their wagon loaded with supplies and their hearts light with possibility. As they descended the mountain trail, Mara looked back at the cabin one last time. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For being the kind of man who stands up when everyone else looks away. For showing me that I was worth fighting for. For loving me when I'd forgotten how to love myself." Boone reached over and took her hand. "Thank you for reminding me that life's not over just because you've known loss. That there's always room for new chapters, new beginnings." They passed through Red Hollow on their way west. The town looked different somehow, cleaner, lighter, as though a shadow had been lifted. People waved as they passed, and more than one person called out thanks to Boone for what he'd done. At the edge of town, they saw a new sign being erected. "James Hartford, Sheriff." Hartford himself was there, overseeing the work. He waved when he saw them, and Boone stopped the wagon. "Heading out?" Hartford asked. "For a while," Boone confirmed. "But we'll be back. This is home." Hartford nodded, understanding. "Good. The world needs more men like you, Boone. Men who stand up. Men who fight for what's right. The world needs more men like all of us," Boone replied. "We just have to remember to stand together when it matters." They shook hands one last time, and then Boone and Mara continued west toward California and new possibilities. The mountains rose behind them, eternal and steadfast, while ahead the horizon stretched wide and open. As they traveled, Mara wore her mother's locket around her neck, the brass warm against her skin. And sometimes, in the evenings when they made camp, she would open it and look at her parents' faces, remembering where she'd come from and thinking about where she was going. Boone had his journal, and he'd started sketching again. Not just wildflowers this time, but Mara's face, the landscapes they passed through, moments he wanted to remember. He was documenting a new life, a new story. They reached Sacramento in early summer, and Mara's reunion with her brother was everything she'd hoped for. Tears and laughter and forgiveness and the re-knitting of bonds that had frayed but never broken. Her brother was a carpenter now, making an honest living, and he welcomed Boone like family. They stayed in California for several months, helping Mara's brother build a house and exploring the possibilities of this new land. But as autumn approached, they both felt the pull of the mountains calling them back. They returned to the cabin in October, as the aspens were turning gold and the first snows were dusting the high peaks. The meadow had flourished in their absence. The buttercups had spread, and new flowers had joined them. It was beautiful, a living memorial to the past and a promise of the future. That winter, Boone built an addition to the cabin, a second room, bigger and warmer. And in the spring, Mara stood at the window of that room, her hand resting on her swelling belly, watching Boone work in the meadow. He was planting more flowers, preparing the earth for new growth. He looked up and saw her watching, and his face split into a smile that made him look younger than his years. Life, Mara thought, was strange and precious and full of unexpected turns. She'd come to Red Hollow as a frightened servant, trapped and hurting. But she'd found a mountain man who taught her that she was worth fighting for. And in fighting for her, he'd found himself again. They'd both been rescued in the end. Not by grand gestures or dramatic heroics, but by simple acts of courage and kindness. By standing up when others looked away. By believing that one person could make a difference. And as Mara watched Boone work, as she felt their child move within her, she knew with absolute certainty that sometimes the greatest battles weren't fought with rifles and strategy. Sometimes they were fought with love and determination and the simple refusal to let cruelty and power win. The sentinel had earned his rest. But the man, the good, kind, strong man who'd crossed the threshold of that mansion and said, "Lay that iron down, or you'll answer to me," he was still there, still standing, still protecting what mattered, and he always would be, because some men are born with a compass that always points toward justice. And Calder Boone was one of them. In the meadow, Boone finished his planting and stood, brushing the dirt from his hands. He walked back to the cabin, to the woman he loved, to the life they were building together. And as he stepped through the door, the mountains stood witness behind him, ancient and knowing. The story of the sentinel and the maid had become legend in Red Hollow, the tale of a man who'd stood against power and won, of a woman who'd found her strength, of love that grew in the hardest soil. But for Boone and Mara, it wasn't a legend. It was just their life. And it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.